Hi everyone, this is Igor from Vinous Reverie, the shop for the adventurous wine drinker. And we're gonna do our show. And this show I'll have a co-host, Kevin Wank from Wust Imports. We're gonna, the concept of the show is gonna be to talk about wine in educational content and hopefully to debunk a lot of the myth that go along with it. All right, and Kevin's about to join us. All right, Kevin, how are you?
Good, Igor. How are you?
All right, so I gave a little introduction, but let me introduce one more time. So this is going to be, the name of the show is Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Wine, but We're Afraid to Ask. And the concept of it is we want to debunk a lot of the wine myth and just educate about the vast and delectable wine world. A lot of regions, a lot of grapes, a lot of different climates and soils that lead to beautiful elixirs. This is episode 1. And in episode 1, we're going to talk about a topic that I think has been major in the last, I don't know, several years, maybe 5 or 6 years, and that's natural wine. What is natural wine? Because I think a lot of people know the very general and vague term of what natural wine is. And I think, Kevin, you being an importer, and I'll let you introduce yourself in a second. I think you go to a lot of these winemakers that you work with, and you actually see how they work. So you have a clear definition of what natural wine is, or at least a clear opinion on what it is. And I think it'd be fun to educate a lot of people who just know it as something vague, like it's grown from organic grapes and there's no sulfites. I think that's basically where a lot of the natural wine discussion ends. It's with organics and sulfites. I think Kevin, first can you introduce yourself, and then let's jump right into the topic.
Yes. So I have a wine importing company. I have wines from 6 European countries, 40 different wine regions, 160 different wines. And what Igor is talking about, I look at from a reverse perspective. My focus is I want to find the purest natural expression of the native varietals. Well, I just use the word natural. And so you might think, oh, well, this guy only has natural wines. Pretty much that's true. But again, what I'm looking for is the purest natural expression of those wines. So I'm looking for wines where there really hasn't been any intervention or manipulation to affect the flavors or aromas of those wines. Is that necessarily a good thing? I don't know, because the reality of all this is what's in your glass. Everybody has different flavor preferences, different aroma preferences. Everybody has different taste buds. And if you taste a wine that is supposedly better for you because it's natural, and it doesn't taste good to you, then you're not having fun with wine. Yeah. So, you should find other wines that, you're going to enjoy more than that, but as you'll hear from some of my comments, there are a lot of different things going on with wine that, I will go over as to what are the differences between wines processed naturally and wines processed in what, interestingly enough, is now called conventional winemaking. But natural wines are not a new concept. You would think with all the press and the buzz in the last 5 to 10 years that, oh, natural wines, this is a new thing. It's not. As some tired or forgetful grape picker found out somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago, they discovered a basket of grapes that they had picked a few days earlier. They were fermenting. And then human beings do seem to have kind of a fun enjoyment of alcohol. And so I don't know if they decided to press them or what they decided to do, but somehow they figured out you could make wine from these fermenting grapes. And it was kind of fun. So natural wines were the first wines. They're not some recent innovation that people have started to, produce in the last 5 or 10 years. At its most simple, natural wines are wines that are naturally fermented. What does that actually mean? Well, an ever-present part of grape growing is there are ambient yeasts on the skins of the grapes. And that's what starts the natural fermentation process. Fortunately enough, most of those ambient yeasts are beneficial in expressing the aromas and flavors of the wines. In some cases, they're not, and I'll get into that, a little bit later. But in any case, natural wines are not a new concept. If that's the case, why aren't all wines, fermented naturally? Well, an unfortunate reality of life is business gets in the way. Anybody in business, if you want to make more money, how do you sell more products? Well, you have, more consistent products that are going to attract a wider audience of consumers. Well, how do you do that with wine when the grapes are different every year? Well, here's where things get interesting. I described that natural yeasts are used to spontaneously ferment natural wines, but yeasts are used to ferment every wine. The wines that aren't naturally fermented, they're not just like sort of like somebody waves a magic wand and they suddenly start fermenting. As Louis Pasteur discovered, over 100 years ago, or I don't know, 150 years ago at this point, I'm dating myself, I guess, the dead yeast cells that he thought were just completely dead, I think the actual reality is by accident, he put them in some medium of liquid. And he realized that they came alive again and started fermenting the medium of liquid that they were in. And so you can take dried yeast cells that have no intrinsic characteristics at that point, but they will start fermenting whatever liquid medium they're in. So then people in the wine world thought, those native yeasts, they can be kind of unpredictable. I'm not really sure what I'm going to end up with at the end of the day. In any case, I've got a whole bunch of my customers that are frustrated with the fact that the wines taste different every year. So voila, which is a French term, by the way, I'm going to use cultured yeast to produce my wines. Yeah. And so I'm going to have a more consistent product every year. Now, I want to respect everybody's preferences. And, if you find a wine that you absolutely love and you want to drink it every night, go for it. Hey, you're enjoying yourself. That's fun. I don't want to be dogmatic, about any of this. But whether you use naturally occurring yeasts or cultured yeasts that are developed, to ferment wine, all wines are fermented with yeast. But, the marketers and the accountants and the business managers, want to have a more consistent product so that they can sell more wine. Sorry to look away for a second, but I have a couple of notes here that, given this, Igor keeps me up late at night, and I may be sleepy or something. But, the other part of the reality of wine is, to begin with, you've got all these different grape varietals. So they all have their own intrinsic aroma and flavor characteristics, but you've got different growing conditions every year. Yeah. And from those different growing conditions, you will have different characteristics in those grapes every year. Now, some people find that interesting and fascinating. The marketers and accountants don't. I mean, one of the most frustrating things in the wine world is you have a really hit wine one year that everybody thinks is just fabulous, and some critic gives it 98 points, and then the next year it's different. But one way to override those differences is you don't naturally ferment your wines. Yeah. You use cultured yeasts that impart specific aroma, flavor, and even texture profiles to your wine. And I'm sure everybody has taken a sip of a glass of wine and says, oh, that's really rich and smooth. Well, you might think that, oh, that's from some star winemaker that really knows what they're doing. No, that's from a engineered yeast that UC Davis developed in their chemistry labs to make wines taste rich and smooth. Now, is there anything wrong with that? If you like wines to taste rich and smooth, no, there really isn't. But from my perspective, what is fun about wine is the tremendous variety of the varietals and how they can all naturally express themselves. And then for me personally, I really enjoy cooking, and I look at wine as just an accent to food And when you have different flavor and aroma characteristics, you've got much more variety in how you can pair wine with food. You know, but
we have some people joining us, and I want to make it maybe interactive. So if anybody has any thoughts on that, I see people's comments. So please type it in, and we'll bring in the topic and discuss it like in the middle of our conversation. So I think it'd be fun discourse. But sorry to interrupt you, Kevin.
Oh, not at all. And I see a little comment thing at the bottom of the screen. I haven't seen how that works before, but if I see a comment pop up, I will address it.
Yeah, I want to be more interactive, I think. But I think this depth of knowledge is just fascinating.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, it's kind of funny about the depth of knowledge. I fortunately had the freedom to spend the whole summer of 2017 in Europe, and that's what started this. Yeah. I was, visiting all these little local wineries all around Europe, where for the most part, their wines don't even leave their regions. Yeah. I mean, these are really small, successful local wineries. The local inhabitants love their wines. They get sold out every year. But as I'm tasting these fully expressive wines, winery by winery, what do I keep hearing? First of all, we only use our own fruit. We do not buy fruit from anybody else. We're out in the vineyards every day all through the growing season, where we know the characteristics of our fruit when it comes to fermenting them. And for most of them, they then naturally ferment the wines. And that's partly a factor from what I just described. They know their fruit. So they know how they're going to ferment, instead of going out and purchasing a bunch of grapes and then have them arrive on the loading dock and then like, well, what do we do with them? Well, we just use the same formula and the same cultured yeast we used last year. But from my experience tasting all these native varietals all over Europe, I was just fascinated with how expressive they are.
Hey, and let's get to jumping in. If you could put it into context, I think if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is that a lot of these big box stores or grocery stores, where you see the same wines, like anybody who drinks wine, they go to the store and they see the same wines over and over again. A lot of them are made in this process with not natural yeast, but commercial yeast that kind of impart a particular flavor through manipulation.
Yeah, effectively, those wines are being made by formula every year.
Yeah.
And one of the more interesting things to me now that I'm 3 years into the business and I'm on to my third vintage with a lot of my producers, is every vintage tastes different, but they also are all interesting.
Yes.
And not interesting in like a weird and funky way, like, oh, isn't that interesting that it just tastes different? But it's an expression of what the grapes tasted like that year. And so I think that's kind of fun. It's a way to mark the individual characteristics of those years. And another interesting thing I found is one of the most frequently talked about topics in the wine world was, oh, how was that vintage? Was that a good vintage? Was that a bad vintage? And what I have found with all these producers using their own estate-grown fruit, where they're out in their vineyards every day, vintages don't matter. Another interesting topic in the wine world right now is global warming. Yeah. It's like, oh, the temperatures are getting hotter, and you do see more extreme weather events, throughout the growing season every year. But for my producers, they're out in their vineyards every day managing leaf canopies, protecting the growing grape clusters. What I've now found over 3 very, very different years, for the last 3 years in Europe, the vintages don't matter because they're protecting their grape clusters. As long as the grape clusters are not exposed to full sun, from these, sudden heat spikes, they're going to be okay with heat because they cool down at night. But, for the more industrialized farming operations that are, producing much higher volumes of wine, global warming is going to affect them a lot more. Because frankly, they're not going to end up with good products in the vineyards as they're sending their hedge trimmers down the rows of vines, making them look like hedges. But in terms of, back to natural wines, I feel like, I haven't really given much information as to what the differences are. I described, the simple explanation of, or a simple characteristic of a natural wine is it's naturally fermented. I've described some of the business reasons, why, wines aren't naturally fermented, for uniform product quality. But, there are some things that possibly could cause people some concerns about wines that aren't naturally fermented. The first is there's this, sort of amorphous, topic of sulfites in the wine industry.
Yep.
And, there was, frankly, what was that, Igor?
Well, the big question, at least the one I get asked, is like, oh, do sulfites cause headaches? So I think, that's a typical question. But yeah, low sulfites, like a big, buzzword within natural wine. So yeah, kind of think it'd be fun to kind of your thoughts on sulfites, the positive, negative effect of, low sulfites.
Yeah, one of the most misunderstood thing about sulfites is you need eventually to have a stable product. I feel like I've made comments about consistently produced wines in a somewhat demeaning way, but you don't want to disappoint your customers by having a wine that's going to be a surprise to them.
Yeah.
And so sulfur is a naturally occurring substance that has long been known to human beings to work as a preservative and also as an antibacterial, agent. And these are, two main enemies of wine. Is possible bacteria in the finished wine that can cause funky aromas and flavors, and then to allow the wine to continue to ferment and effectively turn into vinegar. Yeah. And so at the end of the winemaking process, a very, very small amount of sulfites, are needed to stabilize the wine where it will not continue to ferment and it will inhibit bacterial growth. The most underappreciated aspect of this discussion is that for wines that are not naturally fermented, you need to stop natural fermentation before you add whatever cultured yeast that you've chosen. And it takes 5 to 10 times as much sulfur to stop natural fermentation at the beginning of the fermentation process, as it takes at the end of the fermentation process to stabilize the wine. Now, on one hand, I would prefer to have naturally fermented wines because they're fully expressive. But, frankly, the whole issue of sulfites, I think, is overblown. There was this crazy period in the 80s where you had all these salad bars where the employees of the salad bars were like going and spraying the lettuce like every 20 minutes with sulfites to stop it from being brown. And some people do have sulfite sensitivities. Yeah. And there were people literally going to salad bars and like blacking out, and and the FDA, realized that this was completely uncontrolled, how much these overzealous employees were spraying on the lettuce. And so they actually banned it from being used in salad, or sulfites from being used in salad bars in 1986. Yeah. And ever since then, people are like, oh, sulfites are bad. You're going to have, reactions to it. But think about how much wine is consumed, particularly in the last year. Oh, did I say that? But, if people really had that much sensitivity to sulfites, there'd be a lot more reactions to the sulfites that are present in all wines. The other interesting thing about sulfites, in addition to it being a naturally occurring mineral, it's present in the human body. Without even ingesting food. Well, you think of some foods that are considered very healthy for you. Cruciferous vegetables, broccoli, cauliflower, kale, cabbage. Yes. Very high in sulfur. Yeah. You think of some other things. Eggs. Everybody likes their eggs. It's like, hey, eggs have lots of sulfur in them. Yeah. Little berries that people think, oh, those are great for you. Strawberries, blackberries, lots of sulfur. If human beings really had a problem with sulfur, you would have noticed it. Yeah. But it's just like this vague concept, oh, sulfites are bad for you. They give you headaches. Yeah. Well, although I advocate people enjoying wine, I'll tell you what does give you headaches: drinking too much of it. Yeah. So, maybe the headaches are from you drank a little too much, not from the sulfites. I don't know. Yeah, and fortunately, a 750 is like the perfect quantity because two people can drink that and not get headaches.
Well, and I'm not sure if sulfites cause headaches, but I think high alcohol wines are more likely to cause you headaches than sulfites. Uh,
Yeah, well, that's true. In fact, it's interesting if you think about things quantitatively. California has a real advantage in the wine world. It possibly has the best growing conditions of any wine growing area in the world. Where you get more consistent grapes every year, better crops every year, but there's a downside to that. You get higher alcohol wines, because those perfect growing conditions result in higher sugar levels of the wine. I mean, alcohol is a production of how much sugar was in those grapes, so in fact, it's interesting seeing the bottle that you had in front of you. That's a Chardonnay with 12% alcohol.
yeah.
It's from northern Italy, and whenever I've it's one of my wines, but it's whenever I've opened a bottle, it's like my wife and I can drink it and not feel even remotely hungover the next day. Where you go into the perfect growing conditions of California with higher levels of sugar being produced in the grapes, you end up with a Chardonnay with 14.5% alcohol.
Yeah.
You might say, well, that's only 2.5%. Well, quantitatively, it's 20% more alcohol. And I don't want to trash California wines. I mean, I enjoy them personally. About a third of my personal collection of wines are California wines. But, there really is a difference between the European wines that have alcohol levels of like 12 to 13.5 and the California wines that, almost seem to start at like 14.
Well, and Kevin, it's funny you brought it up. I actually think it's a great topic for a different show because California does make high alcohol wines, and I think a part of its PR is that they make the best wines in the world based on the Judgment of Paris from 1976. But I think what they don't tell you about it is that they don't make wines like they made in 1976. Those wines that won the awards would not win awards if they're made in their current status. So there's that's I think another myth to debunk. But I think it's a fun topic, and maybe we'll tackle it on like a different episode.
Yes, but on to natural wines. There's another unfortunate part of this is that can anybody even agree on what a natural wine is at this point?
Kevin, actually, I recently, within the last year, there's a organization in France that gave some high-level rules to that. So I have them down. So it has to have minimal intervention. The grapes have to be hand-picked. They all have to be certified organic. Only natural yeast are used, like you mentioned, and you cannot have any additives. So that's kind of they're still relatively general, but at least it's like a guideline what like a natural wine is. And, I'll put the quotes around that. Yeah.
It's like, I don't want to get into too many details of what goes on in the sausage factory, but I mean, you just mentioned the generic term additives.
Yes.
In conventional winemaking, in addition to the cultured yeast.
Yes.
That a lot are chosen because they've been engineered to impart aromas, flavors, and even things such as the mouthfeel. Yeah. I mean, the yeasts have a certain texture to them, and you can create a certain mouthfeel from an engineered yeast, but in addition to that, there are additives that technically are inert, but they do add other characteristics to the wines. I mean, coloring agents. Yes. Are allowed to use in wines. Yes. I mean, one of the funniest things about wine to me is, I don't know, people just make a big thing about the color. Mm-hmm. I mean, I just want to enjoy the aromas and the flavors. I don't know why color matters. Yeah. But coloring agents are allowed in wines, or at least in U.S. wines. Yes. But you're right. The France, it's only France, which is interesting because France is part of the EU, so you would think that this would be an EU regulation, but it's only France at this point. And it's funny, they will not allow them to be called natural wines, yes, but they call them vin de naturel.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, it's pretty simple characteristics. organically grown grapes, hand harvested, you know, which is the case with almost all of my wines because it's all estate grown fruit, you know, small producers. It is naturally fermented and it's low sulfites.
Yes.
And what I described earlier is the sulfites that need to be used at the end of fermentation to stabilize the wine are practically non-existent. And the 30 parts per million that are the level permitted for Vin de Naturel in France is above the amount. You typically need 15 to 20 parts per million at the end of the fermentation process to stabilize the wine. You know, for the wines that you've used sulfur to stop natural fermentation prior to using cultured yeast, those wines will typically measure somewhere between 80 and 150 parts per million. But again, think about that. This is 100 parts per million.
Yes.
In terms of, you know, the measured sulfites in the wine. You know, again, particularly with how much people have been drinking lately, if sulfites were really a problem, you'd see people just falling over all the time, you know, and blacking out. But, you know, I want to respect people's, you know, awareness of sulfites and, you know, and just in their personal decision to want to avoid them as much as possible. But frankly, you need small amounts of sulfite to create stable wines at the end of the processing of them.
And Kevin, I think it's a lot of good information, and I just want you to touch base on one thought that I have, and because I think this is a fascinating show, just kind of observation. There's a lot of stores or wine bars, when they were obviously allowed to be open, that were like specializing on the buzzword natural. And like you were saying, I heard feedback from a lot of the customers. They're like, hey, you know what? The wines just weren't that good. These quote-unquote natural wines. And it's typically, I think maybe the younger generation, I think jumps out at that word more so than more experienced wine drinkers. But I think it's sometimes it reduces the pleasure of experiencing wine. But one thing I want you to touch on, to me, like organic sometimes mean the grapes are not sprayed with herbicides and pesticides. But and natural is really vague. I mean, you kind of threw out a lot of definitions. It's a wide scope of what natural is. But what I do think that I frequently see actually leads to a great wine is biodynamic. So can you touch a little bit about biodynamic made wines? Yeah,
I'll get into biodynamic. I see a couple of questions pop up.
Yes.
And the first one was, do organic wines age differently? Here's my experience. Now, with my own portfolio of imported wines, I have 3 years of experience. But here's what I can tell you. I still have some of the initial wines, and they taste better now than they did when I initially bought them. But from my own personal experience, focusing on mainly organic wines, and I'm drinking my reds, usually at 10 to 15 years of age, and my whites at 8 to 12 years of age. The reason organic wines will age better, it's better fruit, you had richer, higher quality fruit to go into the wines to begin with. And so that fruit will have more longevity to it, and so in my opinion, great or wines made from organic grapes should age longer than conventionally made wines. Sure. There was another question, or do organic wines need to be drunk sooner than others? From my comments, about the higher quality of organic fruit, no, the general answer to that is no. But then we get back into organic wines, and if somebody is using, what I would call, undisciplined winemaking processes, you may want to drink those so-called natural wines sooner rather than later, and there's an unfortunate fringe element of the natural wine movement where they feel like, hey, anything we do is fine as long as there's no intervention and it's all natural. And I have kind of a silly analogy to that. I mean, it's almost like your dog or your cat coming in your house with a bird in its mouth or a mouse in its mouth with a big feeling of delight, like, oh, it's all natural. Isn't this cool? Well, that's great, Fido, or, thanks for bringing me that bird. But, a lot of the natural winemakers thinking that anything's okay, it results in unstable wines that people don't enjoy. And I mean, there is, some element of the wine community that likes the more interesting aromas and flavors that result from what, frankly, I would call weird and funky wines. And if you like that, I mean, there's people that eat foods that I think are weird and funky and love them and enjoy them. And if you like that, cool. I'm happy to respect that. But, if I put my nose to a glass, and I smell what was typically called barnyard, I don't want to drink it. And that's from the result of, frankly, sloppiness in your cellar. It's like, I mean, one thing that is interesting, given that I select wines at every producer, is to look at what you might, generically call industrial hygiene that exists in all these producers. I mean, these are just spotless, wine production facilities, because they know that, if they don't keep those wine production facilities, just spotlessly clean, that, there's going to be bacteria that grow that perhaps can get into the wine, additional ambient yeast that can grow in the facilities that are undesirable to get into the wine, but there's a certain sentiment that, that's intervention. Just let nature take its course, so, what I prefer personally is organically grown fruit, because it's higher quality, naturally fermented or natural fermentation, because it allows the grapes to fully express themselves and not have the natural aromas and flavors, changed by, intervention with engineered cultured yeast, but stable and disciplined winemaking processes. I mean, there's some people that think, okay, we're just not even going to de-stem anything. Well, there's a lot of different things that can be on the stems of those grape clusters. Yeah, you have no idea really what you're going to come out with. But just to say, well, it's all natural and it's cool, really, I don't think that's a good answer to things. You want wines that are interesting and appealing to people.
And I think this was Lisa asking the question, at least one of the Nicholsons. And let me put in my 2 cents, Kevin. I actually, from my experience, I would say, to the question that I asked you, natural to me is still a little vague. Not natural, organic. But everything I've read and the wines that I taste is basically biodynamic. It's an actual thing. And like I mentioned, organic kind of sometimes could mean something as vague as not spraying pesticides and herbicides. But organic, there's an actual process when the winemaker is obsessed with keeping the earth healthy, with the idea that if you have a healthy vine, you'll have great wine. And I think frequently that holds true. So I think biodynamic is the buzzword. If you're going to follow buzzwords, biodynamic is the buzzword to follow.
Yeah, I forgot about, you mentioning biodynamic. And so biodynamic does have to be organic farming. But it's an interesting concept that there are cycles in how the world works. And the originator of biodynamics was a somewhat controversial Austrian named Rudolf Steiner, in the early 20th century. And he observed, the growing characteristics of plants and divided them into, plants have flower days, they have root days, they've got, there's 4 types of days, and for some reason late at night I've forgotten the other 2. But you should maintain, or you should administer to those plants according to whatever day they're having. On a root day, you fertilize. On a flower day, I think you actually don't do anything. Then there's leaf days, and maybe the 4th one is stem days or something. But you're supposed to, and there's an organic, if somebody does an internet search, and, under like, biodynamic calendar, you will find things on the internet that will tell you whether it's a leaf day, a flower day, a root day, or maybe it's an earth day, or the fourth one. But there's an interesting part of this too, where a lot of wines do not taste good on root days. And I mean, there are wine reps that will not schedule tasting appointments on root days. And I've observed this myself. I mean, there are a couple of days, it's like, God, that just didn't taste right today. Yeah. And then I'll check the biodynamic calendar, and it was a root day. Yeah. And the days...
By the way, that's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. But, so the principle of biodynamics is to be more in harmony with the natural rhythms of the earth. And I think there's some validity to it. Yeah. But see, the alternative to that is you just go apply mechanical farming methods to everything. And so is the virtue of biodynamics is that they are trying to take a more nuanced approach to, the natural rhythms of the plants, or is the virtue of biodynamics is that they're not applying industrialized farming? I mean, it's, I don't know. I've got mixed opinions on that. I mean, there's some pretty wacky parts of it. You're supposed to collect, hollow cow horns and fill them with cow dung and bury them in the vineyard. What's the difference between filling the cow horn with cow dung and just plowing it into your rows of vines? I mean, I don't know. I haven't gotten into that level of knowledge about it.
Well, Kevin, it's funny. I actually was talking to another importer, and he was telling me that he was an Alsatian producer. Actually a spectacular producer, Barnes Boucher. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that name. And then when the importer was talking to the winemaker actually made him go to the field and taste the soil. And it sounds like you were saying it's a kind of dedication to taking to an absurdity. But the wines are spectacular. Barnes Boucher wines really are spectacular. The Grand Crus, I think, are some of the best Alsatian Rieslings out there. So yeah, I mean, it sounds funny, but I think what's in the glass is not funny. It's actually a spectacular liquid, and you don't get that liquid on a grocery store shelf.
Yeah. I mean, there is a simple reality to this, that if you're taking better care of the soil in your vineyards, you're going to produce better wines. And if biodynamics is the discipline that results in you taking better care of the soil in the vineyards, then, I'm all for it. On the other hand, I have tasted some biodynamic wines in Europe where they give you this big sales pitch about their conversion into being biodynamic and, and all this. And then you taste the wines and they're awful. Yeah. Yeah. And so, at the end of the day, there's no substitute for disciplined winemaking. Yeah. In a professionally executed environment. Yeah. I mean, for people that are just like, oh, well, my ancestors used these 200-year-old wood vats, so we will too. And it's like, and this wines just are funky and stinky. It's like, well, that's all interesting, but I don't enjoy the wines. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's fascinating. I think we went for some time. I mean, Kevin, it's almost 40 minutes, and it's fascinating content. I just want to, before we go, I don't know if it's never been done on Instagram Live, but I'm enjoying this. It's called the Bourgeois Chardonnay that you mentioned, that you import. I would like, 3 cases for the shop, I think for $12. This is a fantastic Chardonnay. Just a quick overview about this wine, Kevin.
Yeah, I mean, this was another fun discovery, and I basically focus on the fruit. And, this was a very nice family, in northern Italy between, Venice and Trieste. They're about, 10 miles west of Trieste. And they're farmers, and they're trying to grow the best fruit possible every year. And another interesting thing I found throughout this is most of my producers are doing almost nothing in the winemaking process. As I described in the initial comments, as some grape picker found over 5,000 years ago, grapes ferment. And so if you're just focusing on growing really good fruit, you're going to produce enjoyable and interesting wines every year. And you mentioned that, wine for $12, and there's another interesting characteristics of grapevines. They're pretty hardy, and a lot of people talk about how much time it takes to maintain the vines. And my producers, they are out in their vineyards every day, but those vines, they produce grapes every year.
Yeah.
And what's meaningful is taking care of those grapes and taking care of the health of the vines, and that's where we're getting into things like organic farming, biodynamic, principles, and stuff like that, because, those grapes are pretty trustworthy. They're going to produce grapes or those grapevines are pretty trustworthy. They're going to produce grapes every year.
And great juice like this one too. Hey, Kevin, thank you so much. So guys, thank you for joining our show. So once again, the name of the show is Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Wine, but we're afraid to ask. Next week, please join us next week. It's me and Kevin, my co-host, and we'll talk about food pairings next week and concentrate specifically on spicy food. I think a lot of people who like spicy food, I frequently get the questions, what's best to pair with that? And I think Kevin has some expertise in that too. So if you guys like the show, this is Igor from Vidas Reverie. That's my wine shop. And Kevin, he has Wust Wines. He's the importer. Check out his webpage and all the wines that he imports and all the fun things about them. And if you have friends that, want to be educated about wine, I think, let them know about our show. Just follow the Vidas Reverie page and you get some fun content. Kevin, thank you so much. And everybody, also, thank you so much for joining us and enjoy the rest of your evening.
All right. Thanks for having me join you. And thanks for everybody else that was watching.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Bye.